The land was red and wide, stretched flat like some ancient beast asleep under the weight of its own bones. Dry sagebrush scratched the edges of the earth, and the sky held its breath, cloudless, colorless, save for a faint bruise of lavender near the western rim. Wind moved in slow spirals, lifting dust into the air like ghosts stirred from their resting places. Jonah Red rode with the silence of someone used to being followed. He kept to old wagon trails no longer marked, his eyes half shuttered beneath a worn brim. His coat was leather, patched and weathered like his face, and his horse, a sway-backed buckskin mare, bore the long fatigue of many miles. They'd passed no soul for 3 days. Then, just before the ridge broke into a descending valley, he saw it, the chapel. It leaned crooked against a brittle cottonwood, its steeple tilting like a drunkard's hat. The windows were blown through, their frames holding nothing but dry wind. Behind it, the graveyard had surrendered to weeds, and a rusted bell hung sideways from the rafters. But what stopped Jonah's breath wasn't the chapel. It was the figure sitting on the split-rail fence, a woman in a wedding dress. The gown was once white, surely. Now it was the color of bone left too long in the sun. Dust clung to the hem like regret. Her veil had torn, a long gash slicing down the back like a wound. She sat stiff, hands clutching the rails, her knuckles pale. No bags, no horse, no shadow near her, but the one cast by her own stillness. Jonah dismounted slowly, boots crunching the brittle ground. The mare huffed once, then lowered her head, chewing dry air. He said nothing, just stood there, letting the distance between them fill with the sound of wind and crow calls far off. The woman looked up. She had the sort of face that didn't ask for pity. Pale, yes, but not fragile. Her eyes were sharp in their sadness, rimmed with the kind of anger that comes after the tears have run dry. She looked at him like he might be the preacher or the devil or both. He took off his hat. She turned back to the horizon. For a long while, neither of them moved. A single seed pod drifted between them, catching a gust, spinning like a coin tossed by fate. Then Jonah said the only thing he would say that day. "You waitin' on someone?" Her throat worked, but she didn't answer. He nodded like that was answer enough. He left her there, sitting in silence, and walked to the chapel. The door hung open, its hinges screeching in the wind. Inside it smelled of old wood and bird droppings. A snake slithered into the shadows behind the altar. He found 2 pews, still standing, sat in the one closest to the doorway, where he could still see her. She hadn't moved. Evening slid down the canyon walls like ink, cooling the heat from the day. The wind changed, smelled now of something deeper, wetter, rain, maybe, or blood. He heard her footsteps before he saw her, slow, measured. She stopped at the door. "You got a name?" she asked, voice low, more gravel than silk. "Jonah." "That all?" He looked up. Her veil hung to one side now, caught in a twig of her uncombed hair. "That's enough." She stepped inside. The veil snagged on the broken frame as she passed through, tearing further. She didn't stop. "I'm cold," she said. He gestured toward the pew across from him. "Ain't much warmer in here." She sat anyway. The silence that followed was thick with everything neither of them wanted to say. Outside, thunder muttered somewhere beyond the ridge. The mare shifted restlessly. He reached into his saddlebag, brought out a flask, and offered it across the aisle. She took it, drank, coughed once. "What kind? Does it matter?" "No," she said, handing it back. "Guess not." They sat like that, sharing the flask in silence, as night sealed the chapel in. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other, high, trembling sounds like heartbreak made sound. She didn't tell him her name, he didn't ask. When the rain came, it fell soft at first, like an apology, then heavier, drumming the chapel roof with hollow hands. He looked over once and saw her asleep, curled on the pew, like a girl abandoned at the altar of something larger than marriage. He stood, moved to the doorway, and watched the rain slick the dead earth outside. His hand rested on the empty holster at his side. not because he needed the gun, but because he missed the weight of it. Behind him, the woman shifted in her sleep, murmuring something lost to dream. And Jonah, outlaw, once feared from Tucson to Cheyenne, leaned against a chapel door in the middle of nowhere and listened to the sound of rain like it might wash something clean. Morning came not with sun, but with silver mist, low and clinging, curling like smoke around the cottonwood trunks. The chapel stood in silhouette, its broken steeple jagged against the haze. The ground was damp. Mud clung to boots and hooves alike. Jonah Red stood at the edge of the graveyard, sharpening his knife on a whetstone, not because it needed it, but because the rhythm kept his mind quiet. The soft scrape echoed faintly, swallowed by fog. Behind him, the woman stepped out of the chapel. She still wore the wedding dress. A trail of dried mud streaked the hem now. Her hair had begun to mat at the ends, and the veil was gone. Left behind or thrown into the dark, he didn't know. She walked with the careful posture of someone who had not been on her own long enough to forget how to pretend she wasn't frightened. You going somewhere?" she asked. "I was," he said, sliding the blade back into the sheath. "Not anymore." He didn't look at her when he said it. She didn't ask why. They rode east, where the earth softened and the sage gave way to scrub pine. The woman didn't have a horse, so she rode behind Jonah, arms looped loosely around his waist, not touching so much as holding on to the idea of it. She said nothing the first hour. Then, as the land began to change color from rust to ochre, she spoke. "Is it stolen?" He knew what she meant. "Wasn't guarded," he said. She didn't smile, but her breath warmed the back of his neck like a secret kept too long. By sundown, they found it, an abandoned homestead, half swallowed by the hillside. Wind had stripped the paint from its walls, and termites had taken the porch. But the bones were good, the chimney still stood, and the front door, though crooked, swung shut if you kicked it just right. She stood at the edge of the yard, arms folded tight. "Whose was it?" "Does it matter?" "No," she said. "Guess not." Inside, dust moved like a living thing, rolling in pockets of gold light. Through the slatted roof, a stove sat rusted in the corner. The bed frame was warped, but the springs still held. In the far room, someone had written a name on the wall long ago, now faded to a smudge, unreadable. They cleared the place without speaking. He took the barn. She took the main room. That night, a fire crackled in the hearth. They ate jerky and dried peaches. She boiled water on the stove, scraping rust flakes from the pot with a spoon. He rolled a cigarette and smoked it out the window, watching stars elbow their way through the clouds. "You a preacher?" she asked from behind him. Jonah blew out smoke. "No." "Soldier?" "No." She hesitated. "Outlaw?" He looked over his shoulder, the lines of his face carved in orange firelight. "Does it matter?" She didn't answer. The next morning she woke early, found a broom in the barn, and began to sweep the dust from the floorboards, her wedding dress knotted at the knees. Jonah sat on the porch, watching her through the open doorway, whittling a stick down to nothing. She found an old rag rug rolled in the pantry and beat it against the rail. A cloud of dirt rose into the sunlight, turning golden at the edges. When she laid it back down, the room looked almost lived in. He brought in water from the stream. She boiled it, soaked her hands in a basin, and began unpicking the seams of the dress with a shard of glass. "Was it love?" he asked, not looking up. She paused. Her fingers hovered in the linen folds. It was something close. Then, "He ran. Before or after?" "During." Jonah nodded. "Guess that's worse," he said. She didn't answer. Days passed without measure. They moved through quiet tasks, patching the roof with tarp and pine, trapping rabbits, boiling roots. The old place began to shift under their presence, like a wound hardening into scar. She started humming while she worked, low, tuneless threads of sound that seemed to come from the floorboards. At night they sat near the hearth. Sometimes she mended things, a button, a strap, a curtain. Sometimes he carved, a spoon, a figurine, a bird with one wing bent. They didn't touch, but the space between them warmed, slow and strange. One morning, Jonah woke to find her kneeling beside the mare, wrapping its front leg in torn muslin. She limps when she steps left, she said, not looking up. He crouched beside her. The mare snorted gently but held still. You know horses? I know pain. He nodded. She tied the knot firm. Jonah didn't speak, but later that day, he left her half his last piece of tobacco on the windowsill. She didn't say thank you. It was on the 5th day that he found her veil, not the torn one. A new one, stitched from old lace curtains, pinned with needles to the wall. Delicate, precise. He didn't ask about it. That night she stood outside beneath the stars, her hands pale in the moonlight. He watched from the doorway. The wind moved her dress, thinner now, after her careful cutting and sewing. The moment held still. You afraid of being found? She asked suddenly. Not anymore, he said. She turned toward him. Why not? He looked at her a long while. Because there's nothing left to take. The next morning she came in from the barn with her hands covered in flour and said, We need to build a fence. For what? To make this place ours. He didn't smile, but he got up and found his tools. In the days that followed, Jonah dug post holes while she counted fence slats. They worked with the steady rhythm of people who had lost everything once and now understood the weight of anything rebuilt. One evening, she tied her hair with a strip of linen the color of ash. What was her name? She asked quietly. He didn't answer. Instead, he placed a battered glove on the fence post, not hers. She looked at it for a long time, then walked back inside. When he came in later, warm bread waited on the table beside 2 chipped plates. The wind shifted that night, carried a promise, not of peace, but of something like permanence, not belonging, but staying. The days grew longer, stretched by slow suns and the quiet labor of hands. The wind settled, no longer a prowler through the walls, but a low companion in the trees. The house, patched and weather-worn, leaned less with each dawn, as if its bones remembered how to hold themselves. Jonah Red worked the fence at sunrise. He moved like someone who had once been hunted, but now walked without urgency. The creak of hammer to post, the dull rhythm of nails sinking into pine, it filled the silence like breath. She brought him water in a tin cup. Her hands were wrapped in linen again, though he no longer asked what wounds they covered. She'd taken to wearing a skirt she made from the lower half of the wedding dress, dyed faintly with crushed berries, uneven at the hem. He noticed, but said nothing. He handed back the cup. Their fingers brushed. She didn't flinch. Inside, she stitched by the window. Not clothing, not any more. Just lines of thread on rough cloth, circles, stars, shapes that held no name. The kind of embroidery done by someone who needed to keep their fingers moving so the past wouldn't crawl back in. Once, he watched her long enough that she stopped and looked up. What? He shook his head. That your way of asking something? She said. Just watching. You watch like you used to be a man who looked away too often. He didn't deny it. The broken pocket watch showed up the next day. She found it in a tin box buried in the barn's corner, the chain rusted, the glass cracked, the hands frozen at 4:12. She brought it to him in silence, holding it out like an offering or a question. He turned it over in his palm, thumb grazing the initials on the back, J.R. Yours? She asked. Used to be. You want it fixed? He hesitated, then nodded. She spent that evening bent over it by firelight, her brows drawn close, her hands steady. She wasn't a watchmaker. She wasn't even sure why she cared. But something in the quiet tick that had long since died, something about restoring it, made her heart settle in her chest like it had somewhere to be. When she placed it back in his hands the next morning, the second hand twitched forward once, then stopped. Almost, she said. He smiled, just barely. It was enough. One night, a storm rolled in from the west, black-bellied and slow. The sky boiled. Thunder was still far, but the smell of it, the metal bite of something waiting to strike, hung in the air. They sat on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair loose and dark in the wind. She spoke first. My name's Luann. He didn't look at her. You already knew that, didn't you? She said. I figured. How? You stitched it. She blinked. What? On the linen the day you dyed it. Bottom edge, tiny. She looked down at her skirt, fingered the seam. You read that? Only thing I read in weeks. She laughed, but it was short, brittle. They called me Luann Wicks. That was the name on the license. Not sure who I am now. He turned toward her. You're here. She nodded, like that was an answer she could live with. Later, after the storm passed and the ground steamed under the moon, he found her in the barn, kneeling beside the mare again. She limps still, she said softly. He crouched beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. Sometimes that don't go away, he said. Sometimes you just walk with it. Luann ran her hand along the horse's neck. I thought I knew what pain was, she said. Turns out I only knew the polite kind. Jonah said nothing, but he stayed beside her until her breath quieted. In the days that followed, they built a small gate for the garden. Planted seeds from a bag she'd found in the pantry. Old, maybe too old. But she insisted. Carrots, she said. Maybe beans, maybe nothing at all. But the act of burying something and believing it might rise, that felt like a kind of prayer. Jonah hung an old horseshoe above the door. She didn't ask why. She carved her name, just L, into the porch post with his knife. Neither of them mentioned the glove on the fence. One morning, he woke to find a new piece of lace draped across the table. Hand-stitched, fragile, beautiful. A veil remade, not out of necessity, but intention. There were tiny white flowers sewn along the edge. He touched it gently. That night, she asked, You ever been married? He shook his head. You? She laughed, but there was no joy in it. I wore the dress. That's as close as I got. Jonah looked at her. She held his gaze longer than she ever had. Would you? She asked. His throat worked. I don't know how. Neither do I. But she smiled. The next morning, the glove was gone. In its place, a wildflower, blue and strange. She found it before he did, picked it up carefully, cradled it in her palms like a memory. Then, without a word, she tucked it into the folds of her skirt. That night, he sat outside long after she'd gone to bed, the pocket watch ticking, once every minute now, stubborn and incomplete. The stars blinked overhead, quiet as breath. Inside, Luann folded a piece of paper, wrote nothing on it, just folded it again, and tucked it beneath the pillow. The next day, he shaved, not for her, not for himself, for the moment that hadn't happened yet, for the thing they were mending together, whatever it was. The morning light came pale, like milk poured too thin. A fog rose off the hills, veiling the land in soft, soundless stillness. Crickets had gone silent in the cool. Even the wind, usually restless at dawn, seemed to pause, as if the world held its breath. Inside the house, the walls wore the hush like an old hymn. Jonah Red stood by the mirror nailed to the inside of the pantry door. It was cracked in one corner and dulled by years of dust, but it showed enough. He had shaved again, carefully this time. Washed his shirt in the stream 2 days ago and laid it out on the rocks to dry. It hung on him a bit loose now, shoulders hollowed by time and hunger, but it was clean. He ran a hand through his hair, found it too long to tame, and left it that way. He walked outside, lit a candle, and placed it on the rail of the porch. Luann would know. She woke to the smell of smoke, not fire but pine, clean burning, gentle, the kind of fire that asks permission instead of taking. The dress he had never seen hung over the window like a ghost, not white anymore, cream maybe, touched by the color of flour and old pages. She had sewn in pieces of curtain lace, small rosettes of thread, trailing down one side like forgotten vines. No train, no bustle, just linen softened by hand and time. She stood barefoot on the floor, the wood warm beneath her. She didn't speak, just dressed. Jonah had cleared the front yard. The fence they'd built together made a quiet square around the house. He'd laid wildflowers in boot heels along the edge, bluebonnet, firewheel yarrow, each one picked and placed with awkward care. There were no chairs, no preacher, no guests, only the empty fields and the faint sound of bees working through clover. She stepped out onto the porch, bare feet on the boards. The veil rested in her hands, not on her head. Jonah looked up from the post he was leaning against. He didn't smile, just stood there, as still as the house itself, as if moving might break the spell. "You're late," he said quietly. She lifted a brow. "You never asked." He nodded once, and that was enough. They stood beneath the cottonwood. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the leaves. Somewhere, a hawk called once and then fell silent again. Jonah reached into his pocket and pulled out a small square box, wooden, plain, with a crack down the middle. He opened it. Inside was nothing. He offered it to her. She looked down at the empty space where a ring should be. "It's beautiful," she said. He closed the lid and handed her the box. She cradled it like a fragile thing, as if it might hold more than it showed. He cleared his throat. "I don't got the words for this." She stepped closer, close enough that their shadows merged. "We're already here. That's the word," she said. He reached out then, gently, took the veil from her hands and draped it over her head. The lace fell across her shoulders like light filtering through trees. They stood like that, a breath apart. No vows, no kiss. Just the quiet click of the pocket watch in Jonah's shirt, almost ticking. That night he lit every candle they had, lined them along the porch rail, the windowsill, the edge of the hearth. The light spilled soft over the fence, touched the boots at the door, kissed the spoon he'd carved weeks ago and left on the table. Luann stepped into the yard barefoot, the hem of her dress catching dew. He offered her his hand. She hesitated, then took it. No music, just the sound of the wind and the occasional creak of wood shifting under the weight of memory. They danced, slow, uneven, the kind of dance that remembers more steps than it knows how to do. She laughed once, quiet, startled by her own joy. He didn't laugh, but his eyes softened, and that was enough. Later they sat on the porch steps. Her veil hung from a nail above the door. The candles burned low, wax puddling in forgotten tins. "Do you think they'll come?" she asked. "Who?" "The past, the people, the names we tried to forget." He looked out at the dark fields, quiet and still. "They always come." She nodded. "But not tonight," she said. "No," he agreed, "not tonight." He reached into his coat and pulled out the watch. Opened it. The second hand twitched, clicked forward. She leaned her head against his shoulder, said nothing. Far off, lightning cracked behind the hills, but no thunder followed, just light, with no sound. Like something remembered, too late to hurt. Inside, the house held its breath. Outside, the veil caught the breeze and fluttered once. They watched the stars come forward one by one, as if shy to be seen. The fire inside the hearth burned low, then lower, and still they sat. The rain began at dawn, not with thunder, not with wind, just the steady hush of it, soft and silver, like an old woman's lullaby. It soaked the world slowly, working into the soil and the seams, into the cracks of fence posts and the lines of a man's face. Jonah Red stood in the barn doorway, staring out across the pale morning. His coat hung on a nail behind him. His shirt was damp at the shoulders. The mare shifted beside him, calm in the quiet. In the far distance, the ridge was hidden behind a curtain of rain, blurred like memory. Inside the house, Luann moved with a kind of silence not born from fear, but from knowing something had to end. She had braided her hair, not neatly. The strands wove and twisted in odd places, some falling loose down her back. Her hands were red from washing. The wedding dress hung over the chair, folded now, no longer worn. On the table sat the empty ring box, its crack mended with twine. She lit a fire, not for warmth, but for ceremony, laid kindling like she was laying flowers, stoked it until it burned clear. Then she took a page, just one, from the small drawer by the hearth. No writing, just folded once, twice again. She set it on the flames and watched it curl, the white, fading into black, black, curling into nothing. Behind her, Jonah stepped inside. Rain clung to his hair, his boots left wet prints on the floor. He stood near the door, watching her, as if unsure whether to speak. "You're leaving," she said, not turning. He didn't answer. She faced him. "It's all right," she said. "You're not the staying kind." His jaw worked. Something behind his eyes moved, slow and buried. "I thought maybe I could be," he said. She stepped forward, barefoot on the wooden floor. "And I thought maybe love was a thing you could build like a fence," she whispered. "But some things still find their way through." They stood a few feet apart. The fire between them cracked once. He reached into his pocket and brought out the watch. "I got it ticking," he said. "Almost right." She took it, held it to her ear. "I like the way it stumbles," she said. "Reminds me of us." Outside, the rain deepened, not loud but full. It fell on the garden where sprouts had begun to press up through the earth. It fell on the roof they'd patched together, on the wildflowers still in their boots, on the fence they'd built, post by post, hand by hand. Jonah saddled the mare. She helped him cinch the strap. Neither said much. At the gate, he turned in the saddle. The brim of his hat drooped under the rain. "You'll be safe here," he said. She nodded. "I always was." He looked at her, long and full, not like a man leaving something behind, but like a man who had found the shape of his absence. She raised the veil, still tied to the post, pressed it once to her lips, then let it go. The wind caught it. It drifted across the field like a soft white bird, then sank slowly into the grass. Jonah watched it disappear, then he rode. She stood at the gate long after he was gone. The rain touched her like fingers brushing off dust. It pooled in her collarbone, ran down her arms. Behind her the house stood still, leaning slightly, but not as much as before. She walked back to the porch. Inside, she found the glove, his. Folded into the pillowcase, still damp from the morning, she buried it in the garden, not deep, just enough. The earth closed over it like a secret. In the weeks to come, Luann worked the soil, watched the fence for rot, stitched a new cloth for the table. The second hand of the watch clicked once every other breath. Sometimes she talked aloud, though no one answered. Once she heard boots crunch gravel near the gate and stepped outside with a hand to her brow. But it was just a fox, lean and red, trotting through the rain without pause. By spring, the garden bloomed. Not much. A few crooked carrots, beans too small to boil. But in one corner, by the glove she'd buried, something else grew, tall, thin, stubborn. A single stalk crowned with small white flowers, shaped like lace. She sat beside it one morning, the veil folded in her lap, and smiled. One night, just before summer, a stranger passed through. Old man, eyes yellowed with time. He asked for water, and she gave it, asked if this place had a name. She thought a long time, then said, "No," and closed the door behind her. In the barn, the saddle still hung on the wall. The fence still held. And in the house without a name, the watch ticked softly beneath her pillow, not perfectly, but enough.